Good afternoon. Bill, thank you so much for joining us here. You think about climate change really comprehensively, so we've got a lot of ground to cover today. But I want to start almost at sort of the highest, most existential level. And there's been so much doom and gloom, but also a lot of hope. We've been talking about this tension all day. And I want to contrast a couple things I've heard over the last week or so. We have United Nations Secretary General Guterres saying that the Earth is about to become uninhabitable. Mike Bloomberg, who was on the stage with me earlier this morning, said that this was something that could kill every person on Earth. And yet when I heard you speak on Tuesday, you said the planet is going to be fine. I want you to help us reconcile these contrasting statements. Do you think Guterres and Bloomberg are being hyperbolic, or are you really so sanguine about this issue?
Well, I'm, the largest funder of action on climate, including grant money, innovation money. I'm out in Africa and the foundation work seeing farmers who are deeply affected, and that's why, I chose to get educated and get involved going back around the turn of the century, because that's where I'd moved on my full-time work from Microsoft, and this was a topic that I got engaged in. Climate tries to use science and numbers, and look at, at various levels, what are those effects? It's mostly, there are effects on humanity. The planet, less so. It's a fairly resilient thing. But, the reason I'm engaged is because it affects human welfare.
Right. And I want to talk about the issue of health in just a sec. This issue of planetary boundaries, though, it seems to be coming up more and more. When we see oceans reaching 100 temperatures on the surface, when we see coral bleaching, when you see the biodiversity loss and the destruction of rainforests, to hear you say that the planet is really resilient, I think would surprise a lot of people, given just how dramatically the Earth is changing in such a short amount of time.
Okay.
Do you really believe that some of that damage that I just described could really be taken care of, mitigated in a short amount of time in a way that doesn't go on to compromise human welfare and health?
Well, as I say, I'm very involved in climate. There's been progress. Should climate be the only thing we do? Should we buy measles vaccines? Should we pursue polio eradication? I believe that human welfare can be improved in many ways, and climate is an important way to make sure that we continue the progress that we've had. But how do you balance, should you buy measles vaccine? When we go out to raise money for polio, we're raising less money now than before. Right. Our organization is the most articulate, going around the world saying rich countries should be more generous, whether it's for climate mitigation, climate adaptation, health budgets, vaccines. So we're on full blast saying that equity demands we be more generous. Climate is one of those causes. And if you thought the planet was going to break in two, I guess you'd say, hey, stop wasting money on measles vaccination, because if that is the case, then who cares about kids dying of measles? But I also care about that.
Right. And as I understand it, you actually came to your work in climate through your work in global health. And you've made stunning advances, as has the global community, in reducing disease and early mortality all over the globe. I wonder, though, is there a concern in your mind that some of the effects of climate change might erase some of those gains in global health that we've achieved through medicine? For example, when hotter temperatures are making malarial mosquitoes prolific in higher altitude cities in Africa, does that create a new challenge that, again, is going to roll back some of those gains we've already achieved?
Absolutely. There's no way in the year 2000, 10 million children under 5 died. And we've cut that in half. We're down at 4.6 million deaths per year. It's one of the greatest achievements of humanity. It was actually the centerpiece of what were called the Millennium Development Goals. Fortunately, we're not going to go back to 10 million children are dying. Malaria is still out there at 400,000. Having trouble raising money. Polio is still out there, paralyzing kids, having trouble raising money. So there's, the actual lens that I see climate through happens to go more through malnutrition. One of the greatest injustices in the world is that in these poor countries, a third of the kids don't grow up with full physical or mental development. And that's because it's more difficult to grow food. And so helping them in these near equatorial regions where the vast majority of the impact is, that's a very just thing, given that these are not the people who cause this problem in any way, shape, or form.
But it sounds like you have a lot of faith in adaptation, that with the right crop development, with the right farming practices, with the right medications, large swaths of humanity that, again, many people are painting in really apocalyptic terms, suggesting that whole nations might become uninhabitable. It sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that you believe that there's a real pathway towards using technology and the advances in medicine and agriculture to allow continued human flourishing in some of those most exposed regions to extreme temperatures.
Well, I'm the person who's doing the most on climate in terms of, the innovation and how we can square multiple goals that, we still care about children dying, honest, at least we do. And, how can you do climate effectively? There's very limited money for causes to reduce inequity in the world. And no temperate country is going to become uninhabitable.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear.
The climate people have to decide, are we the science number people or you really want to make your arguments, based on what you actually know, about, okay, how much is the planet itself at risk, for example.
Okay, I want to come back to some of those points. I want to talk about technology, though. Here in the United States, we're experiencing a real renaissance in wind and solar, electric vehicles, batteries. Some of these technologies are starting to see real exponential, sort of hockey stick-like growth that you'd be familiar with from your time in the tech industry. Does the rapid gains in some of these specific technologies that are obviously reducing emissions give you hope or change your calculation that maybe we'll be able to reach some of these very lofty net zero goals for our broader economy sooner than perhaps we might have thought even just a couple years ago?
Because the number of source of emissions is very large, and because some of those are extremely hard to abate. 60% of emissions comes from middle-income countries. And so even if the rich countries go to zero, your delta temperature effect is very tiny. The rich countries, we do have to lead. And you can look sector by sector. Solar, now the interconnect limitation, the transmission limitation. So we created a nonprofit group that's about the grid. Implementing the IRA very quickly. So we created a nonprofit group that we fund called Investing in Our Future. It's just to accelerate those things. In every area of emission and every policy, we need more philanthropic dollars. We need more smart people. We need more consumers willing to buy green products. So there's nothing, we're not on a path to get to, a 1.5 degree limitation. Climate, it's changing the entire industrial base. So it's an extremely hard thing to do. Innovation gives you a chance of doing it. And what I've seen in the innovation space, that I committed to create breakthrough in 2015, it's gone far better than I would have expected, even in very tough areas like steel, cement, agriculture, hydrogen. What we're seeing is very promising, but not at a level where you'd say, oh, this, move on from this. That's, why, we built this incredible team. We partner with governments and philanthropists, and, it's got many pieces. It's got fellows, venture, policies, open source grid models. We've started up a dozen philanthropic organizations that are to accelerate these things. It's, it's a serious effort.
Absolutely, and we're not done yet, to your point. I wonder, though, when you think about some of those technologies that you're invested in, you mentioned the hard-to-abate sector, you're also very interested and involved with things like modular nuclear. And I think for some people, they think about next-generation nuclear, the potential for fusion, and hold these out as hopes that maybe they will be some of those technologies that do sort of make a step change rather than sort of this more incremental progress that we've been seeing so far. What's your thoughts on how close some of those new technologies might be and what the challenges might be in terms of permitting or regulation to getting them implemented at scale?
Yeah, so we do open source grid models where you can look at, for every country, because again, rich countries are a very small piece of this. They have a special obligation to get to zero first and to get these things on the learning curve, so the green premium, the extra cost of being clean, is driven to zero. So you actually have a way of getting diffusion into middle-income countries. Sadly, if you try to subsidize it, you're at many multiples of what the foreign aid budget is. And so it's just, the voters aren't going to come up with that. So innovation is the only way you can achieve these goals. Doing the green grid is very hard because you're not just taking today's electricity, you're taking the electricity that's driving buses and cars and steel plants and direct air capture. You're having to come up with all the electricity. So it's 2.5, 3 times larger. And that's very daunting. And you can use these models and say, okay, if we don't have any nuclear fission, we don't have any nuclear fusion, we don't have any geothermal, we just have those limited set of things, that degree of difficulty and how long it's going to take practically is much, much higher. But we can't count on broad acceptance of fission. Putting billions into that, it would make new reactors with no high pressure, no afterheat problems, different economics, it would be a helpful tool. And the only reason that I do that is because of climate. It's not like I decided the nuclear industry is a fun way to make money or something. And likewise, fusion. There's 16 fusion companies. I'm an investor in 4 of those. It's a question of when, I would say. Not only do we get fusion, but we get it in a form that can make cheap electricity. There's quite a variety of approaches. And this deadline means that we're very much in a hurry. Not only do we need to get things, but then the time it takes to deploy them in the world at large, you're going to have to leave 20 to 30 years for some of those things. And that pushes you past the deadline that we're all trying to achieve.
Right. And what you just said is especially true in the global south, where for all sorts of reasons, it's much harder to deploy capital for clean energy investments, for example. All of which is to say, fossil fuels, particularly gas and coal, are going to be with us for many decades to come, it seems. A lot of people look at those numbers and throw their hands up in the air and say that this essentially ensures that the planet, to use the Secretary General's words, will become uninhabitable. What's your view on the fossil fuel industry? Again, some people really vilify them. Other people today, Mike Bloomberg said he views them as a part of the solution. How are you thinking about their role in this energy transition?
Well, they're a very heterogeneous group of companies. Some, work in renewable energies. Some provide R&D dollars to things like biofuels that could be an important substitute. There's no doubt today that if you tried to make hydrocarbons illegal, that the voters would rebel against that. They like driving to work. There's a variety of practical things, and so there is a demand there. The ideal is that you set a carbon tax that's the same size as what it takes to do direct air capture, and so but that would mean that the cost of cement and gasoline and air travel would be dramatically higher, right. Because we haven't innovated in those spaces. We have gigantic green premiums, and whenever voters are tested, like in France, you put on a diesel tax. Well, they say, oh, those people in the city are richer than me. They somehow should pay for this. In Germany, when you say, okay, we're going to make you buy electric heat pumps, they back off from it. So if you try to do climate things brute force, you'll sometimes get people say, hey, I like climate, I'm for climate, but I don't want to bear that cost and reduce my standard of living. And, I believe we should spend a lot of money on climate change. I believe we should have very high carbon taxes. The political realities are such that without innovation, it's unlikely, particularly in middle-income countries, that the brute force approach will be successful.
Yeah. You've mentioned carbon capture and sequestration a couple of times now, and that obviously people point to as an important part of the solution set going forward. But we've seen that people sort of view it in different ways. Some people, Al Gore today in that chair, said that many people, fossil fuel companies, are using it as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. While others, and including in your book, you present it as an important tool that will help mitigate that last vestige of emissions as we're able to draw down in sector after sector. How do you think about carbon capture and its role? Is it being used as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels, or should it be developed as sort of this edge case that cleans up the last of the mess?
Well, there's no excuse for not getting to the point where we get to zero CO2 emissions. In terms of avoiding the unknowns of what it's like to get certain temperature increases, we have to get to zero emissions, and that's a very daunting task. Both the subsidization and the non-taxation of oil and gas is a barrier. If you could politically put that tax on, that's a very good thing. The scale of carbon capture is very hard to say. It's one of these path-dependent things. We don't want a path that's dependent on fusion, but we want to maximize the chance that that's among the tools we have available to get to zero emission, because it makes it so much easier to have these very dense, non-weather dependent, near to the power load ways of making electricity. So yes, in the Breakthrough Energy portfolio, we have a number of companies that are trying to bring the cost of carbon capture down. Today I'm the biggest individual customer in Climeworks, which does carbon capture at over $300 a ton. There are companies that will get us to $100 or well below $100, but even so, for 10% of emissions, $50 a ton, that's $500 billion a year, 3 times all foreign aid. So how much that will scale up, I'd say that's an unknown, because how is that financed?
Can you say a bit more about something you just mentioned? You're the largest individual customer at Climeworks. Climeworks is one of the most scaled and advanced carbon capture and sequestration companies. What does it mean that you're the single biggest customer? What does that look like? What kind of a customer are you?
Check.
Yeah. But are you offsetting your own personal emissions with that? And can you give us a sense of the scale of that?
It's like 10 million a year.
Okay. And just
it's a variety of things. The Climeworks is part of it. Buying electric heat pumps for low-income housing where they get the benefits of lower monthly bills, and I take the carbon credits for those things. There's solar panels. There's a huge variety of things. I don't use some of the less proven approaches.
Such as?
I don't plant trees.
There's a lot of people who are very enamored with trees. We've got trees on this stage. Some people would even say that if you just planted enough trees, it could take care of the climate issue altogether.
And that's complete nonsense.
Okay.
I mean, are we the science people or are we the idiots? Which one do we want to be?
I'm going to call my friend Mark Benioff and ask him what he thinks. At the very moment that we're trying to find all these new sources of clean energy, energy demands around the world are rising in just about every economy, including here in the US, in some measures driven largely by data centers and the demands of artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. As someone who is such a pioneer in the technology industry, do you have any thoughts on the role of the tech industry itself in helping create this problem that you're now trying to help solve?
Well, I would say the tech companies, because they are very profitable and they can afford to take a long-term view, they will be among the pioneer buyers of long-term storage, green energy solutions. Now, the way you do the metrics to them, you got to keep them honest, that it's not, just buy a certificate and say, oh, the green electrons come to me and the dirty electrons go to all those other people. And this, you can always look at dollars per ton. If somebody thinks they're doing something at well under $100 per ton, you should be skeptical. The Climeworks is kind of a clearing price, and there are a few things like avoiding methane emissions actually that are pretty low cost, but not that many. And this is a gigantic scale problem. The induced electricity demand in the U.S. is not very large. We'll get it as we electrify cars, buses, industry, home heating, replacing natural gas. So we will get about a 2.5 times electricity increase. The data center load, in that it'll be something like 4 or 5%. And there's some really brilliant things, particularly in terms of AI execution, that may drive that back down below 1%.
The word policy is in the title of this session, and I know you personally intervened and helped save the IRA at a pretty pivotal moment last year when it looked like it might fall apart. I wonder how you think about its record so far. What does the implementation of it actually look like? And more broadly, how you rank President Biden's climate policy. A lot of people are very supportive of the IRA, of course, but also very, very frustrated that he continues to allow drilling on federal lands.
Well, we should tax oil and gas no matter where it comes from. The idea that, okay, if we don't drill it here, if it's untaxed, it's going to get drilled somewhere. The key thing is that you've got to take this externality, which is the CO2 emission, and make it unattractive. And as you do that tax, then you have alternative things come in. Which in the case of passenger cars, okay, getting down to the low end is hard, but we need to get there. The IRA is a very dramatic set of money to bootstrap key technologies, including into areas that most climate people don't talk about. I mean, industrial emissions. If you don't solve that, the whole thing doesn't get solved. And what it does for green hydrogen, what it does for long duration storage, some things it does in transmission, bootstrapping some direct air capture. It's a fantastic climate bill. If people think some other politician would have gotten more, great. They should vote for that person. But we're trying to implement it as quickly as possible. There's a lot of funding opportunities for people who care about that. We're helping DOE work with Treasury to get the regulations, get those written well. The faster we implement it, the more people see the benefits of jobs, particularly in areas where the hydrocarbon jobs will be less over time. So, the implementation phase of that bill, plus the two bills that were bipartisan, the CHIPS and Science Act and the infrastructure bill, it's just an amazing opportunity, but we have to make sure people see it. It's kind of like Obamacare. At first, people are like, what is this thing? Okay, 10 years later, they're like, oh, I get it. We don't have that much time to keep this thing intact. It's not guaranteed that tax credits necessarily last out the full 10 years because they can be repealed if you get a change in political control.
Earlier today, I asked Al Gore how he, as someone who's spent his whole career in politics, explained the Republican Party's continued opposition to climate action. What's your answer to that, having worked in Washington to get the IRA passed? How do you explain the reticence of so many Republican elected leaders to engage with this issue in a way that scientists and other sort of climate advocates feel is in good faith?
I have a lot of partners who fund Republicans and engage Republicans in a pretty deep way. There's some interesting data on young Republicans and their commitment to this. So my reaction is not to demonize, but rather to say, okay, why are, if we're so convinced and we're actually, going to stick to the facts, why have we failed to bring more people along? And this is a super important thing. So whenever I meet, people who do climate philanthropy, I'm like, oh, you know how to connect out, and some of them have a history of working with Republicans, I think that's extremely valuable. You can't have a climate policy that when one party's in charge, it goes full speed ahead and then it stops dead cold. These are 30-year investments in steel factories, fertilizer factories, new ways of making meat. I mean, it requires a constant full speed ahead in order for the U.S. to be an exemplar, which if we're not, then it's not likely we'll succeed.
You just mentioned new ways of making meat. My very next guest is Gilberto Tomazoni, the global CEO of JBS, the biggest meat packer in the world. What would you say to him? I mean, you can say it on the way out, but are there, do you have questions or challenges for a company like that with such an enormous scale that's operating in the Amazon? How should they be thinking about their role and responsibility, and what do they need to do to change?
Well, in some cases, we've got to outcompete the things that drive deforestation, because the difficulty, yes, you protect this land, but the demand signal's still there for this other land. So, we need to make the equivalent of palm oil cheaper than palm oil. Ideally, meat, even though it's off of its initial excitement, the new generations coming along are far better. So every industry, whether it's JBS or people aiming at typewriters, they're always subject to significant innovation that changes the rules of the game. In this case, there's a huge negative externality in terms of methane emission and land use that comes broadly from agriculture, but from beef in particular. And so, we've got to fund the innovation almost at an unnatural level so that we take that demand signal away.
Thank you. I'm going to bring this up with him. Thank you for that. Sticking on the topic of agriculture, you earlier mentioned some of your own efforts to account for your own emissions by being the largest customer of Climeworks. You're also the largest, or among, the largest personal owners of farmland in the country. In your book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, you have a whole chapter about agriculture, and you write about the need to pursue regenerative practices. How much of that work is actually being done on the land you personally own, which I understand is made through your investment vehicles, but still nonetheless you own and control? Are you starting to use your personal farmland as a way to drive this kind of policy change that you want to see?
Yeah, I own 1/4000th of the farmland, and it was not something where I woke up and said, oh, I want to live on a farm or something. It's not green acres. And we run those farms very efficiently. There's a thing called Pivot Bio, which is a fertilizer substitute, which looks pretty fantastic. It's early days for that, but we've been the pilot customer. So there's a lot of practices we're able to try out. But as a percentage, it's as of my wealth or of the farmland, this is pretty small.
Understood. Nevertheless, I just wonder how you think about it. It sounds like you're starting to use it sort of as a laboratory for some of these practices.
Everything I do is climate conscious.
And so you would make the argument that including, I understand it's only 1/4000th of the farmland in the United States perhaps, but if maybe I can even go with you to check some of it out. If we went there, would we see regenerative organic practices on that land?
Not organic.
Okay. Why not?
Because that means putting more pressure on deforestation by making less food per acre.
Well, if the invitation ever arises, I will happily go walk some of that land with you. Another policy issue, if I may. All week, there's been a lot of talk about proposed reforms to the World Bank, the IMF. Later this afternoon, in just a couple hours, we're going to have World Bank President Ajay Banga along with Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados right here on this stage. There has been, in these reform efforts and in the Bridgetown Initiative, which Prime Minister Mottley helped develop, a scenario sketched out where if the World Bank changed some of its requirements, some of the way it operates, it would be able to unlock trillions of dollars in private capital. This is sort of a dream people have on how we might be able to rapidly scale climate finance around the global south. Do you believe that's feasible?
No, the numbers, yes, you can squeeze a bit more money out of the World Bank. The main important thing, most people don't look at that balance sheet. The main thing the World Bank does that really improves the human condition is a concessional finance arm called IDA, International Development Association. That is funding primary health care, schools, nutrition programs, unbelievable things. It's somewhat depleted nowadays, and it requires more money. It requires grant money. You know, the generous donors are the Europeans. They're under a lot of strain with the money that they need to give to Ukraine. The recipient countries have higher interest rates, you know, can no longer add to their debt level, so that's a definite constraint. So yeah, we wake up every day thinking there should be more resources to help the poorest, help them deal with climate, climate adaptation. Compared to mitigation is really massively underfunded. Even the most basic high-scale thing like making better seeds for those farmers that are higher productivity and deal with the temperature and get rid of the pressure to do deforestation by being more productive. Even that is ridiculously underfunded. So, you know, in the world I'm in, we have finite financial resources, and, you know, unless the U.S. Congress completely changes its priorities, there's no trillions of dollars thing out there. We can tune some of the parameters. Mostly we can spend the money better. We can use innovation. So I'm a hopeful person. I'm hopeful about childhood death, childhood malnutrition, climate change. But, you know, I try to bring a numeric framework where I don't see some trillions of dollars fund available. You know, are people willing to increase their taxes? You know, even the IRA bill, you know, wasn't able to put, say, corporate profit taxes back to where it had been. And, you know, so it's a challenge. We are going to have to solve climate and health problems in clever ways. We will not be able to brute force them.
Thank you for that. We are fast out of time, but I want to just ask you one final question. You said you're a hopeful person, and I will say you're more hopeful than some of the other business and world leaders I think we've been hearing from this week, which is refreshing in its own way. I wonder, what is your then call to action? I know you have a portfolio of interests, but for those who are specifically interested in climate, what's your message to people who say, well, how can I help? I get these reader emails all day. What can I do? What do you say to people like that?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of your own buying behavior, whether it's buying offsets, whether the food you buy, the electric car, the heating in your house. Those early demand signals where somebody pays a green premium create volume and drive innovation and competition and get us to the only point that is scalable out into the world at large. So consumers really do matter a lot. Their political voice, if they're Democrat or Republican, you know, Republicans for climate change action are gold. You know, that's got to be a number that somehow we manage to increase over time. Your voice as an employee in your company who's, you know, buying cement, buying steel, buying electricity, you know, in increasingly legitimate actual ways of doing those things so that you can have a lower emission footprint. And so there's tons of ways to get involved in this. It's been amazing, you know, in schools where we've actually had people who go and learn the steel industry, which, you know, the best and the brightest were not thinking about that. But the increase in talent that's driving this wave of innovation, that's a key reason why I'm hopeful.
Bill Gates, thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.